Hello, everyone. So the experience I wanted to share with all of you is a dream that I had. And so in this video, I'm going to go over my dream, and then we'll cover what I learned from it, the interpretation, and then we'll discuss what I learned further in the book of Revelation from that. We'll go from there. So in this dream, Jacob and I, we were walking along in the foothills of here in Utah County. It was a dirt trail along the foothills, parallel with them. And we were just talking and enjoying each other's company. And eventually we came upon a patch of loose dirt on the left of the hill. And we both said, hey, let's go dig it. And so we both went over to the loose dirt and we were starting to dig it out with our hands. And eventually we uncovered a coffin, and in the coffin there was a skeleton. We had uncovered the upper half of it. And so we saw it and kept digging, and we saw on its wrist was a tag, and it was one of those like big store tags you would imagine. And on this tag was the name Pompeii. And we both got really excited and saying, Pompeii, that's halfway across the world. How did it end up here? This could be a big revelation of how they traded or traveled or the extent of their civilization. So we got really excited and decided to continue digging it out. So as we were digging, though, I noticed it started to stink. So I said, I'm done. I'm out. So I hopped out. And Jacob this is too big of a discovery to just leave. And so he continued and he started digging out the lower half. And I was watching him. And at this point, the dirt didn't look so much like dirt anymore. It was more like brown, papery, loose stuff. It was really light. And I realized that was ash later. So as he's digging it out, I'm watching the skeleton and he begins to get skin. And he gets a full head of hair, and he just looks like a normal person sleeping. And after a little while, he starts to make those stretching faces like he's waking up. And eventually he does wake up, and he steps out of the coffin and looks at Jacob and I, and he tells us his name. And I knew his name. It was very, very familiar to me. Oh, and he was wearing a blue robe. But he was very familiar to me, and I remember being excited and telling Jacob, hey, I know him. But after the dream ended, I couldn't recall it. So after telling us his name, he then proceeded to tell us other things. And this is what he said. He said, come and pray that you be not destroyed. And I was very surprised. And I asked him what he meant by that. I was questioning him like that. What kind of a greeting is that? And he again said, come and pray that ye be not destroyed. Then he told us of two meteors to come, the second more deadly than the first. And one is in eastern Missouri, is what he said, and the other near. And I saw that one fall near the Utah-Wyoming border. And I saw that one fall. And when I saw that, it came back and we were talking again. And he again invited us to say, by saying, come and pray that you be not destroyed. And at that point, both Jacob and I walked closer to him, and he began to pray over us. And as he started that prayer, the dream closed. So that's where the dream ended. And that was on the 28th of May, a Thursday. And Jacob and I, we went on a hunting trip later Saturday, the 30th. And that's when I told him about the dream because he was involved in it. And I was like, any ideas? And so we were thinking about Ezekiel's dry bones coming to life because that was the most obvious, the skeleton coming to life. But continue thinking about that. So Jacob had mentioned to me that I should pray to have a dream to know what that dream meant because that had worked for him. He had had dreams before, and he had prayed to have a dream about it, and he did. So I took his advice, and I had prayed that I would have a dream to know what it meant. And lo and behold, I didn't have a dream. But later in the week, it would not leave my mind. I could not stop thinking about my dream. And the tag that was on the skeleton's wrist came to mind, and very, very clearly with the name Pompeii written on it. And that started my searching. And I was directed to go to Google Earth and look at the locations where I saw the meteors fall. East of Missouri, I looked there and I didn't really see anything significant. And then I looked at the Utah-Wyoming border and saw that just north of it, by 100 miles or so, is Yellowstone National Park. And Yellowstone volcano is a supervolcano on the U.S. continent. And so that got me thinking in relation to Pompeii. Hey, Pompeii was destroyed by a giant volcano. Perhaps that's the relation here. So then I continued to do my search. So after realizing that Yellowstone was nearby, the Utah-Wyoming border, I decided to look up Yellowstone volcano maps on Google. And I did an image search, and this is what you see is one of the first images that came up. It's not necessarily a map of the volcano, but it's by USGS, which generally covers earthquakes. And what I found interesting is that both locations where I saw the meteor fall are both red, which is a higher potential, as it says here, the intensity potential earthquakes of ground shaking that has a 2% chance of occurring in 50 years. So it has a 2% chance of occurring in 50 years, but those are the high danger points of it. So it's very interesting that even though there are more red spots in the country, such as in California, that both the spots where I saw the meteor fall are red. So after discovering that got me a little excited, and I continued to search. And I was directed to read in Revelations 8 and 9. And in there, it talks about the trumpets that sound after the half hour of silence ends. And there are, in those 7 trumpets, you'll see that only 2 of them are stars that fall. It's the 3rd and the 5th. And the 3rd angel sounded, and there fell a great star from heaven, burning as it were a lamp. And it fell upon the 3rd part of the rivers, and upon the fountains of waters. And the name of the star is called Wormwood. And the 3rd part of the waters became wormwood. And many men died because of the waters, because they were made bitter. Okay, so that's the first star that falls. And it falls on rivers and the fountains of waters, 1/3 of them. And the 5th angel sounded, and I saw the star fall from heaven unto the earth. And to him was given the key of the bottomless pit. And he opened the bottomless pit, and there arose a smoke out of the pit, as the smoke of a great furnace, and the sun and the air were darkened by the reason of the smoke of the pit. And there came out of the smoke locusts upon the earth, and unto them was given power as the scorpions of the earth have power. So the second one that falls on the bottomless pit, which has a great furnace and puts out enough smoke to darken the sun and the moon and the air. So that sounded pretty descriptive of a giant volcano. So that fit the description of my dream. Also, it seemed to fit the order of the second one being at Yellowstone of a giant volcano. So continuing in Revelations, I was directed to read in chapter 21 to discover the New Jerusalem coming down. And so John is directed to measure it. This is in Revelations 21. And I, John, saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down from God out of heaven, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And the city lieth foursquare, and the length is as large as the breadth. And he measured the city with a reed. 12,000 furlongs, the length and the breadth and the height of it are equal. So I did another Google search, and I found that 1 furlong is 660 feet. So multiply that by 12,000 furlongs and convert that into miles from feet is 1,500 miles. So again, I went to Google Earth and I mapped it out, and this is what I found. I measured on Google Maps, fit 1,500 miles, and I took the eastern border of Missouri as the eastern border of this square, representing a New Jerusalem. And I shifted the bottom border down to include as much land as possible. I knew I could go a little bit further without including any ocean. So that's the resulting square. So I continued to do more research on Yellowstone, and this is what I found. I found that the Yellowstone volcano has erupted several times before, I think twice, if I remember correctly, and they had measured the ash cloud of one of the eruptions, and as you read on the left side, the maximum thickness of the volcanic ash reaches up to 660 feet, which is exactly 1 furlong. So I thought that was very interesting that the measurement of New Jerusalem was measured in furlongs and 660 feet, which is the exact depth of the ash cloud. I also looked up possible damage range were it to explode again. And that's what you see on the right side of this image, is the black outline is from USGS, apparently as well. And that's the outline of the resulting ash cloud where if it were to erupt again. If you notice from the previous slide, it's practically fills the exact same square. Eastern border is East Missouri. It goes left to California and up high into Canada. See, that's very much the same square, essentially. So that got me really excited. And thinking about perhaps this is it, 'cause with the two squares adding up, matching. So I did a little more research. On the left here is the extent of the Yellowstone volcano, and on the right is called the Wyoming Thrust Belt, and it is where I saw the meteor fall, is on that. It's higher than the Utah most northern border. It's about where you see the DT. That's where I saw it fall, is right about there. And if it were to hit there, it would disrupt all of these stress points, as you see in red, and you'll notice that one of them curves right into Salt Lake City. And if prophecies are right, Salt Lake is going to be a heavy hit area. So that got me a pretty good view of Yellowstone, and with the connection to my dream, having those impact areas for the earthquake, the ash clouds, all matching up. So I decided to turn my attention to Missouri, and this is what I found. Having watched a video previously about the 7 timelines, they talked about the eclipse being 7 years apart and making an X over the United States. So I decided to look at where that X was, and sure enough, it's on the east border of Missouri, East Missouri, which is where that high earthquake impact zone is for that area. And that just astounded me, saying that they overlapped. So I believe, yes, that is a significant area. After realizing that, I was directed to, again, this was all learning within one afternoon, and I was told where to go. And I was told to look up the description of the Garden of Eden being in Missouri. As far as I know, that's where we know it was. And this is in Moses. And I, the Lord God, caused a river to go out of Eden, which is in Jackson County, Missouri, according to Modern Revelation from Joseph Smith, to water the garden, and from thence it was parted, and became into 4 heads. And I, the Lord God, called the name of the first Pison, and it compasseth the whole land of Havilah, where I, the Lord God, created much gold. And the gold of that land was good, and there was bdellium and the onyx stone. And the name of the second river was called Gihon, the same that compasseth the whole land of Ethiopia. And the name of the third river was Hiddekel, that which goeth toward the east of Assyria. And the fourth river was the Euphrates. So from here, remember onyx and Euphrates, because they'll come up later. And in Revelations 9, it talks about, so here's the Euphrates. And the sixth angel sounded, I heard a voice from the four horns of the golden altar, which is before God, saying to the sixth angel, which had the trumpet, loose the four angels which are bound in the great river Euphrates. So those two rivers, they're the one and the same. So the river Euphrates, being in the area, is in Missouri. Because the river that goes out of Jackson County, Missouri, the Garden of Eden, splits into four, one of them being called the Euphrates, and that's the river that the angels are called out of. And so that is the area where the eclipse crosses over. And the four angels were loosed, which were prepared for an hour and a day and a month and a year, for to slay the third part of men. So again, we see the name Euphrates, and the other highlighted part, the timing, an hour, day, month, and year. Keep track of that. So also having a description that there are onyx stone in that area from that one of the rivers encompasses. I looked for onyx mines in the United States, and this is what I found. In Kentucky, western middle Kentucky, just east of the eastern border of Missouri, is our onyx caves. So that fits the description very much in that area and having onyx. So that all got me excited, and that also seemed to fit. So then I was directed to look at the Missouri River, which at the time I did not know existed. I knew of the Mississippi River, that one's famous, but I didn't know of the Missouri River. So I Googled it, unsure what I'd find, and this is what I found. As you'll see on the inset on the bottom left corner, you'll see a square of the region that this river encompasses. It is almost exactly the same square that I drew as a representation of the New Jerusalem, with the eastern boundary being East Missouri, going up into Canada and over to California. It's practically the same, and that pretty much solidified it for me. That three testimonies, my dream of those areas, the volcano being that, and now the river region, all independent sources having the same square. It's pretty astounding to me. So I continued reading in Revelations and came across Revelation 16. And if you read it, I think you will find and agree that it's a second revelation that describes the same events as chapters 8 and 9. And the third was the star that fell upon the rivers, 1/3 of the rivers, and they became bitter of wormwood. So chapter 16 shares slightly different details. And the third angel poured out his vial upon the rivers and fountains of waters, and they became blood. And I heard the angel of the waters say, Thou art righteous, O Lord, which art and wast and shalt be, because thou hast judged thus. For they have shed the blood of the saints and the prophets, and thou hast given them blood to drink, for they are worthy. And that solidified to me that that is indeed the location, because it describes for you the reason that that is the area, because they have shed the blood of the saints and the prophets. So the only prophet that was murdered on the U.S. continent in modern history is that Joseph Smith. He was murdered in Carthage, Illinois, which is just east of the Mississippi River in Illinois. So here is the map of the United States Union, the states that were in the Union at the time of his martyrdom, except this one's a little previous. He was martyred in 1840, and the states of Missouri, and Arkansas were also in the Union, which is west of the Mississippi. But what's interesting is that this is all the states east of the Mississippi were part of the Union. So I decided to check it out, and I went back to Google Earth and mapped out the landmass east of the Mississippi and west. And this is what I found. The whole continental U.S. landmass is approximately 3.3 million square miles. West of the Mississippi is about 2.3 million square miles, and east of the Mississippi is about 1.1 million square miles. In other words, east of the Mississippi is 1/3 of the continental U.S. landmass, which is pretty astounding to me because the 1/3 fit is a common number in the scriptures. And so after seeing that, I was directed to look into the Mississippi River, same website as the Missouri River for the information I got. And on the left, you see the extent of that. And on the right, you see a detail of the Mississippi River. There are 250 tributaries of the Mississippi, which drain a total area of more than 1.2 million square miles, or 1/3 of the nation's landmass. The Mississippi River drains 1/3 of the continental U.S. landmass and watershed, which is exactly what the book of Revelation says in chapter 8, that it fell upon 1/3 of the waters and rivers and fountains of waters. So again, that matches the description. So that's the end of my dream and what I was learning. But obviously, I had to have a question of when is this happening? And I was told 5. And I was really confused. I'm like, 5 what? 5 days, weeks, months, or years? And I was again told 5. And to look at my calendar. So I opened up my calendar, and this is what I found. I looked at the date when I had my dream, which was May 28th, a Thursday. And looking at it, May, it's the 5th month of the year. The 28th is in the 5th week of the month. And it's a Thursday, which is the 5th day of the week. So that kind of set up a precedence for me that 5 is, in fact, an important number. I looked at the current day when I learned all of this in this afternoon, and it was June 2nd, 5 days after my dream. So that set a precedent of a future event based from my dream. So I looked ahead. Okay, so 5 days works. What about 5 weeks? That takes you to July 2nd, which was the due date of my son, who was born 5 days early on June 27th. And so that was a significant event that matched up perfectly. So 5 days, 5 weeks, that matches. So I looked at 5 months, and that took me to October. And at the moment, I thought it was only significant because of General Conference being in that month. But I also timed it before the second eclipse, which is April 2024, and which is on Monday, and which is 1 day after General Conference. But yeah, it's exactly 3 years and 6 months before the next eclipse. Okay, so that's significant. And then I looked ahead 5 years, and that puts me in May of 2025. The eclipse occurs April of 2024, and May of 2025 is 1 year and 1 month from the time of the eclipse, which is the time which crosses over the Euphrates River, which is the time that is said that the angels waited that were and prepared that were called out of the river Euphrates. So that seemed to match up with the possible time of the sounding of the 6th trumpet. And when I thought of 5 years, I was reminded of a dream I had earlier than this other one. And in this dream, I was in Salt Lake City with my kids and wife. It was a late spring day or early summer, and while we were waiting for my wife, she was in a building running some errands, and while me and the kids were out on the street walking. And when my wife finished her errand, she came back out and joined us, and we all started walking back to the car. And all of a sudden, I hear the sound of a pure trumpet fill the sky. And I looked up to see where it was coming from, and I could not tell. It was just a normal, clear, semi-cloudy day, and it sounded very clear. And I've played the trumpet for more than 10 years now, so I'm very familiar with the sound of a trumpet. And I remember when I heard it, having this feeling of excitement and kind of nervousness at the same time. And that's when the dream ended. Interestingly, my kids were about 5 years older than what they are now. And so that also took you into 2025 from this dream. So in Revelations 9, it talks about the locusts that come out of the smoke from the fifth trumpet, which I believe hits Yellowstone. And the shapes of the locusts were like unto horses prepared for battle, and on their heads were, as it were, crowns like gold, and their faces were as the faces of men, and they had hair as the hair of women, and their teeth were as the teeth of lions, and they had breastplates, as it were the breastplates of iron, and the sound of their wings was as the sound of chariots of many horses running to battle. And they had tails like unto scorpions. There were stings in their tails, and their power was to hurt men 5 months. So that's the description of the locusts. And now we'll look at the description of the horsemen, which is in the sixth trumpet. And the number of the army of the horsemen were 200,000, which is 200 million, which is about 2/3 of the current U.S. population. And I heard the number of them. And thus I saw the horses in the vision, and them that sat on them, having breastplates of fire, and jacinth, and brimstone. And the heads of the horses were as the heads of lions, and out of their mouths issued fire and smoke and brimstone. And by these three was the third part of men killed, by fire and by the smoke, and by the brimstone which issued out of their mouths. For their power is in their mouth, and in their tails, for their tails were like unto serpents, which had heads, and with them they do hurt. So, reading and comparing the description of the locusts and the horsemen, they were nearly identical, having breastplates, a head of a lion, a body of a horse, and a tail of a serpent or a scorpion. They were very, very similar. So that made me think that perhaps the horsemen and the locusts are the same entity, not necessarily a literal locust or a literal horseman, but they're descriptive of either other physical features or the tribes or the time of this entity. So having the description, it talks about the scorpions having a sting in their tails, and with them they do hurt. And it came to pass that they drew down their weapons of war, and they would not take them again, for they were stung for the murders which they had committed, and they came down even as their brethren, relying upon the mercies of those whose arms were lifted to slay them. This I found during the week's reading in Come Follow Me. I found that very interesting that they use the word sting, and that's the only other one besides the sting of death and the sting that talks about in Revelations. So in a discussion with the family on the previous video, David mentioned that, like those that were stung with the scorpions, they wished for death and could not find it. Turns out that Laman and Lemuel felt the same way. This is in 1 Nephi 17, verse 20. And thou art like unto our father, led away by the foolish imaginations of his heart. Yea, he hath led us out of the land of Jerusalem, and we have wandered in the wilderness for these many years. And our women have toiled, being big with child. And they have borne children in the wilderness, and suffered all these things, save it were death. And it would have been better that they had died before they came out of Jerusalem, than to have suffered these afflictions. Laman and Lemuel felt exactly the same way. They wished for death, and yet they did not. They thought it better to have died in the destruction of Jerusalem than to have escaped that destruction and to have suffered, which is exactly fits the description of wishing for death and yet not dying. Okay. So back to the possible description of the entity I was talking about, of the locust or the horseman. Jacob would like to explain further.
we were talking about that in the stars there are a lot of things that are significant. One thing too is that I've learned is that the stars didn't necessarily talk just about Greek or Roman mythologies or things. It's also the symbols of the stars actually had previous names and stories before the Greek and Roman mythologies. These are things that were actually taught to the prophets. Abraham knew them. Anyway, so looking to the stories and the real meaning of these things, I was telling my brother about it, and he was kind of skeptical because he didn't think that looking to the stars was very appropriate.
Like mystical, like
people look to the stars for their horoscopes and things like that. But my understanding is the stars weren't there just for horoscopes. They were there to testify of Christ. You've got Virgo, who's a virgin, who signifies the birth of Christ through a virgin. You've got Pisces, who is actually tied to a serpent or a dragon with has two lines. They're tied to the serpent. Among those same stars, you've got a goat or a ram that has his foot on those lines, breaking the lines, signifying that Jesus Christ is the Lamb of God who will atone for sin and death, freeing the fish. And so that you have two fish, and you've got two lines binding us to the dragon or Satan. And those two lines are sin and physical death. But Christ, as the sacrifice, will break both of those and free us. So there's lots of other symbolism talking about Christ. And so you look to the stars, and we're going to talk about another thing in Revelation that was shown in the stars. So it led us here where what if the locust, the description of the locust, lines up with the stars? And so you've got the description of the locust where it says that it had a face of a man, body of a horse, teeth of a lion, hair of a woman, had breastplates as if iron, and a tail of a scorpion. And so you've got a couple of things. So teeth of a lion, that's what comes first. When you first see a lion, that's first. First see this beast or these locusts. Well, the orders of the zodiac are also significant. So
if you start at the stars and you look at the current screen, you start with Leo, face of a lion, the first, or teeth of a lion. So you have that first, and then you have the hair of a woman. Next in line in the stars is Virgo by date, sequentially. You have Virgo, a woman. Next in line, you have Libra, which is symbolized by the scales. These scales or balances are symbols of justice and of judgment, which, interestingly, fire and brimstone are also symbols of. So that seems to line up. And then if you have next, sequentially, you have Scorpio, or a scorpion, the tail of a scorpion. And so that matched up. And if you continue one more, you have Sagittarius, which is a centaur, which has the body of a horse and the face of a man. So, and interestingly, Leo starts July 23rd about, and Sagittarius ends December 21st. By date, if you include those 5 constellations, it is 5 months by date. 5 whole
so
months.
Having the locust, a description that matches the zodiac, and the dates of the zodiac matching 5 months, as the scripture says that the locust will torment men for 5 months. It matches with the zodiac as it's possible that these are the months that the locust will come and torment men.
So in there also talks about iron. So Mars is the symbol of iron. So filling the description, here we are in the app of Stellarium. It's the star constellation, and you can do it by date and see what the stars are like. So in here, we start with Leo, teeth of a lion, Virgo, hair of a woman, Libra, breastplate of fire and brimstone, iron, jacinth. You have Scorpius, which tail of a scorpion. And in modern history, in like recent years, the astronomers have added Ophiuchus, the snake bearer, into the description. So that fits the description of interesting that it's being added today, because a serpent is the tail of the horseman. And then next in line you have Sagittarius, face of a man, body of the horse. So on this particular day, which is December 30th, various years, every year about the end of December, the sun passes through the crown of Sagittarius. It talks about the locust wearing a crown of gold. The sun has long been a symbol of gold. So having that planets and stars as symbols of metals got me thinking, and I found that Mars is a symbolic of iron. And it also talks about jacinth. Jacinth is a reddish-orange gemstone, which, interestingly, Mars is a reddish-orange planet. So that also seemed to match up in the description. So that got me thinking that perhaps Mars is involved in the timing. So in 2034, with the breastplate, Mars 2034, Mars is in Libra, while Sagittarius is crowned with the sun. If we change the years to 2028, Mars is at Virgo's shoulder, as in she is dressed with iron. Similar to when the Virgin gave birth to the child, then fled into the wilderness. The sun was at Virgo's shoulder, as in being dressed with the sun. If we continue to go down and in date and go to 2025, we see that Mars is sitting over the shoulder and cape of Sagittarius, as though he is vested in iron or jacinth. And so any one of these dates could be a possibility of that being the timing of when this is to occur.
Another thing too is, just I didn't point out about the sun though, it mentions that it was crowned with gold. Something too is interesting is at this point, as you see on the screen, the sun is actually at the top of Sagittarius' head, as if he was crowned. So that's just another thing that was interesting.
Okay. So read in Revelations 13 and 17. It talks about beasts. And I stood upon the sand of the sea and saw the beast rise out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his horns 10 crowns, and upon his heads the name of blasphemy. And I beheld another beast coming out of the earth, and he had 2 horns like a lamb, and he spake as a dragon. So I didn't include anything from chapter 17 here, but basically John is asking the angel what the beast was, and the angel says that they are kingdoms and kings. So understanding that description, China, dragon, Russia, bear, which matches it. So that's, I believe, the first beast that rises out of the sea are foreign kingdoms. The beast that comes out of the earth, I believe, using that same logic, is one that comes out of our own continent, our own country, which matches the prophecy of Ezra's eagle, which says that a tyrant would rule this nation, such as none has been ruled ever before. So I took the liberty of looking at the animal symbols of our states, of the United States of America, as following after the animal symbols of other nations. And I found that 2 states have the animal symbol of a bighorn sheep. And those 2 states are Nevada and Colorado. So in here, in verse 11, it says that he spake as a dragon. So I believe that this tyrant, the dragon being symbolic of China, is either a Chinese descendant or a Chinese sympathizer. He speaks like a dragon. He behaves like them. So I think that's what we're looking for when it comes to the rise of this beast. In Doctrine and Covenants, it talks about, well, in Revelations, it talks about the beast deceiving all the nations. And if it were possible, he would deceive even the very elect. So if you go to the footnote of deceive, one of those footnotes is Doctrine and Covenants 52. And this is what it says. And again I give unto you a pattern in all things, that ye may not be deceived. For Satan is abroad in the land, and he goeth forth deceiving the nations. Wherefore he that prayeth, whose spirit is contrite, the same is accepted of me, if ye obey mine ordinances. He that speaketh, whose spirit is contrite, whose language is meek and edifieth, the same is of God, if ye obey mine ordinances. And again, he that trembleth under my power shall be made strong, and shall bring forth fruits of praise and wisdom, according to the revelations and truths which I have given you. So Christ does say that he will work in patterns, and if we recognize those patterns, we are less likely to be deceived.
In chapter 16, verses 17, it talks about the 7th vial, and it says that during this time, it says, and there fell upon men a great hail out of heaven, every stone about the weight of a talent. And men blasphemed God because of the plague of the hail, for the plague thereof was exceedingly great. Now, we look at this, a weight of a talent. We did some research on that, and a talent is a measurement that they used in the Bible and that time. A talent weighs about 75 pounds. So it's a great weight. It's a big weight. And it says, and the stone, every stone about the weight of a talent. So these were, the hail were stone, which were quite interesting. Now, something that I thought was interesting is because it talks about,
in chapter 12 of Revelation, it talks about the dragon and the woman.
Yeah. So in chapter 12, it talks about the dragon and the woman. In it, it says, so here it says, chapter 12, verse 4, or I'll start in verse 3. And there appeared another wonder in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and 7 crowns upon his head. And his tail drew the 3rd part of the stars of heaven, and did cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman, which was ready to be delivered, for to devour her child as soon it was born. So something that was interesting is I looked up, we've seen that the woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, giving birth to a child, or Jupiter. We've seen that happen in the stars. And so I wondered if the same revelation, if the woman was in the stars, wouldn't the dragon be in the stars? So I looked up about the dragon, and of course there's Draco. He's a dragon. And I was looking at it, and it was, I don't know, I didn't find anything too particular that really shocked me at first, but I looked up about meteors falling, and because it talks about in Revelation about these huge stones, and so my thought was that they were meteors actually instead of a hailstorm, a big meteor shower. Well, as I was searching about Draco, it found that there are meteor showers that are called draconoids because they come, as it looks like, from Draco. And these actually happen fairly often, and there's some that sometimes or some years there's a lot more than others, but these are a lot. This really is a big meteor shower. Well, you've got these draconoids coming from Draco, which follows like
the description of the dragon casting the stars down, 1/3 of the stars. It says that he takes the stars and he casts them down, which is interesting. If you take the stars casting down, it fits the description of meteors.
And one thing too is, as I was looking up Draco, like where is Draco and the stars, and I watched this lady and she pointed out how you can find it in the night sky, because I thought I wanted to do that. And I am here, you can actually see it a lot better. You've got Draco, which its head starts over here and its body curls around and its tail wraps around Ursa Minor. Now, and it goes between Ursa Minor and Ursa Major. Now, here's something that I find interesting. The size of Ursa Minor and Ursa Major, the size of the two stars, it looks as if to me that if you were to combine those stars together, the size, Ursa Minor and Ursa Major, that Ursa Minor is 1/3 of that mass, or the area of the sky, which also I thought was interesting, how its tail draws 1/3 of the stars. And then you have the draconoids, these meteor showers coming as if it looks like from Draco, and thought that these meteor showers would follow the description of being the weight of a talent.
So it is possible that this could be the interpretation. I mean, it could be actual hailstorm, but that's going to be one massive storm to keep up 75 pounds in a cloud. So I think that meteors is a great description, or a great possibility of this. Any other details? Oh, yeah, Daniel 12 talks about the desolation of abomination. Daniel 12 talks about the abomination of desolation in the end. So Daniel asks, when shall these times be? And let's see if we'll find that scripture just a second. The end of 12. And from that, and from the time that the daily sacrifice shall be taken away, and the abomination that maketh desolate set up, there shall be 1,290 days, or 3.5 years. So, interestingly, all temples around the world were closed due to coronavirus. And that to me sounds like the daily sacrifice has been taken away. We have yet until the abomination desolation is set up, I believe. In Daniel chapter 8, it talks more about the abomination of desolation. And Andy and Jacob made a point that it was a king that rose up that literally entered the temple and desecrated it and then destroyed it. So I think that's what we will be seeing later, which has not yet happened, but I believe will be soon. And I think it'll match up with this beast that rises up. And with it being rising up to power on our own continent, I think will be because of they are elected into power, which I don't think is this election year, but possibly the next couple. If it is the 2024 election cycle, it would match up with the basic timeline of Revelation, according to the 5th and 6th trumpets, and when the beast rises, which is approximately the 5th and 6th trumpet timeline, which puts you in about 2025. And the election is in 2024, but the president won't actually take power until 2025. So I think that's the timeline we're looking at.
So something that was interesting, I'll actually go back up here. As my brother told me the interpretation of his dream, and we looked up Ezekiel and the dry bones. As we were driving home, I actually read Ezekiel, the account of Ezekiel and the dry bones to him, just because we just wanted to know what it says, and we were both kind of like, oh well, that's kind of cool. But if you go and read in Ezekiel, it talks about how Ezekiel was shown a valley of dry bones, and it was like desolate. And an angel comes unto him and says, or he asked something about when shall these rise again, and he was told, prophesy unto these bones that they will receive flesh. And so Ezekiel turns to the bones and he prophesies that they will receive flesh, and they do, and he sees it happen. And then the angel says unto him, prophesy that they will receive life. And he turns to these bodies now and prophesies, and they receive life and they rise up. And this is an example of a resurrection. Well, similarly, the only thing that was really interesting is that's kind of what Josiah saw in his dream with this man who is in the coffin. It was bones that first received flesh and then received life and stood up. Well, at work, soon after Josiah actually told me about his dream, randomly, out of the blue, one of the coworkers comes in to the office and he said, have you read this story, or have you heard of this story? And he's like, this is one of my ancestors, and this is an experience he had. And I hadn't mentioned anything to anybody at this point, and it was just really interesting. He just came in and said this. Well, I thought it was interesting. He's like sharing this story, and I read this story and it hit me, partly because of what happens. It was amazing. And he actually, without me even asking, he says, hey, do you want a copy of this? And I'm like, yes. So I got a copy and I shared it with Josiah and my family and stuff. And this is something that's really, really cool to me. So this is Ezekiel Johnson. You can actually find this account on Family Search, and you look up Ezekiel Johnson. Now here's his ID number, which will take you right to him, or you can look up by name and date and find him that way too. Well, this is the story that was shared. And he says, I requested to relay an experience I had in 1908 or 1909 in San Juan County. This is in Utah. I was just making a home in Blanding, and the whole country there was covered with trees and sagebrush. I was working to clear the ground to plant a few acres of corn. We had 5 acres cleared and had started to plant the corn. My little son Roy was 7 or 8 years old, was there to help me plant the corn. I would plow around the piece of ground, and then he would plant the furrow with corn, when I would cover it and plow it again. While I was plowing in that piece of ground, I discovered that there were ancient houses there, that is, the remains of them. As I was plowing around, I noticed that my plow had turned out the skeleton of a small child, the skull and the backbone. Most of the bones, of course, were decayed and gone. Part of the skeleton was there, so I stopped immediately as the plow had passed it a little. I turned and looked back against the bar of the plow between the handles. As I was looking at the little skeleton that I had plowed up, wondering, all of a sudden, to my surprise, I saw the bones wiggle and begin to change position and to take on a different color. And within a minute there lay a beautiful skeleton. It was a perfect little skeleton. Then I saw the inner parts of the natural body coming in, the entrails, etc. I saw the flesh coming on, and I saw the skin coming on the body when the inner parts of the body were complete. A beautiful head of hair adorned the top of the head, and in about a half a minute after the hair was on the head, a child raised up on her feet. She was lying a little on her left side with her back towards me. Because of this, I wasn't able to determine the sex of the child, but as she raised up, a beautiful robe came down over her left shoulder, and I saw it must be a little girl. As she looked at me and I looked at her, we just looked at each other, smiling for a quarter of a minute. Then in my desire to get hold of her, I said, "Oh, you beautiful child," and I reached as if to embrace her, and she disappeared. This was all I saw, and I stood there and wondered, and I thought for a few minutes. My little boy was wondering why I was there, because I was down at the other end of the row, anxious to come and plant the corn. Now I couldn't tell that story to anyone because it was so mysterious to me and such. Why should I have such a miraculous experience? I couldn't feature a human being in such a condition to accidentally plow that little thing up and see it come to life. The body of a child, 5 or 7 years old, I'd say. I couldn't tell the story to anyone until finally one day I met a dear friend of mine, stake patriarch Wayne H. Reed of Blanding. He stopped me in the street and said, "Zeke, you had an experience on this mesa you won't tell. I want you to tell it to me." Well, I told it to him. Then he had me tell it to meeting houses and many socials, fasting meeting and conference time. I wondered, and it worried me for years as to why I was allowed to see it, a common man like me, uneducated. Why was I, a common man, allowed to see such a manifestation of God's power? One day, as I was walking alone with my hoe on my shoulder, going to hoe some corn, something said, "Stop under the shade of that tree for a few minutes and rest." This just came to me, and I thought I would, so I stopped there, and this was given to me. It was an answer to my prayer. I had prayed incessantly for an answer to why I was privileged to see that resurrection. I was told why. When the child was buried there, it was either in a time of war with different tribes, or it was winter time when the ground was frozen and they had no tools to dig deep graves. They just planted that little body as deep as they could under the circumstances. If it was during time of war, they couldn't possibly take the time to dig a deep grave. When it was done, the sorrowing mother knew that it was such a shallow little grave that in her sorrow she cried out to the group that was present, "That little girl, the first beast that comes along, will smell her body and will dig her up and scatter her to the four winds. Her bones will be scattered all over the flats." There happened to be a man present holding the priesthood, a Nephite or Jaredite. I don't know which, because they both had been in this country. I've been in their houses, I know it, this man said. "Sister, calm your sorrows. Whenever that little body is disturbed or uncovered, the Lord will call her up and she will live. Since that time I have taken great comfort, great cheer and consolation and satisfaction with praise in my heart and soul until I haven't the words to express it, that it was I that uncovered that little body. Thank you for listening to me. I just can't tell you without crying. Zeke Johnson, son of Joel Hills Johnson." So this was an experience of a resurrection. He saw this little girl be resurrected in front of his eyes, as was prophesied, as this man with the priesthood prophesied that would happen to her. It was such a blessing for him to have, as he mentions it. Now, here's something that was interesting. You have Ezekiel in the Bible who has an experience where he sees the exact same process where bones receive flesh and then receive life and raise up. Ezekiel, in our day, saw the exact same thing. He sees bones receive flesh and then rise up after it receives life. So with that experience, the same process was in Josiah's dream. And to me, it was a confirmation. There was multiple witnesses of the same thing. God mentions that he works in patterns, and that by multiple witnesses, we may know certain things. So that was interesting to me. Something as well is we know of scriptures where, because of the Book of Mormon, we have scripture that Joseph in Egypt prophesied of Joseph Smith in the latter days, that he will be called after his father, Joseph. This was a prophecy that Joseph in Egypt had about another Joseph. Something that was also interesting. And so you've got Ezekiel also having an experience that Ezekiel in our day sees the same thing. Something that was interesting too is as we were studying about these things, we were told or shared, it was shared with us about Ezra's eagle in the Apocrypha. Now, we normally don't read through the Apocrypha because it's not canonized, but it's still something that we can look up, and you can look up and read it. And we were directed to this man's website where he actually talks about his interpretation of it and things. So, and I also went and read Ezra. Well, Ezra's eagle is something that's interesting, is because as you line up the events in Ezra's eagle, it lines up with a time period where Ezra Taft Benson, a prophet of our church, the vision starts when he was in the Department of Agriculture for our country. And later he was a prophet of the Lord. And this is something that was really interesting to me too, because you have Ezra prophesying of a time when another Ezra and a prophet would be here on the earth. And to me, it shows part of by multiple witnesses, and also the great blessing that Heavenly Father helps comfort us in times of stress by also probably showing to them namesakes of righteous men who are their namesake and that follows them. So you've got Ezra and Ezra, Joseph and Joseph, and Ezekiel and Ezekiel. It was just something that showed to me the truth of these things.